A very warm welcome, View Conference delegates. I'm Dave Williams from RNIB, and in the next little while, I'll share my experience of education as a blind student and my career in accessible technology and radio production. I'll introduce some of the influences that I think shaped my life so far, and along the way, I'll offer some thoughts about the challenges facing our blind and partially sighted young people. As well as my lived experience as a blind student, I have a blind nephew whose parents are familiar with the many challenges securing the adjustments that he needs at his primary school. Plus, my wife, Mrs. Williams, is also teaching assisted daily living skills to blind and partially sighted teenagers. I regularly hear from parents of VI students and many of you working in the sector. So, while it has been a couple of years since I left formal education, hopefully I'm still vaguely in touch. But let's start with a question. Who teaches blind kids how to shave? A sighted parent? Perhaps. But this seemingly simple personal grooming task is considered by some to be potentially dangerous for blind and partially sighted people. You could ask the same question about ironing, crossing roads, or DIY. Most of us need to shave, we really do, and even if we choose not to, we should at least know how. Let's come back to shaving a little bit later. My aim in this talk is to suggest some ways in which we can work together as a community to break down the biggest barriers facing blind and partially sighted people, namely low expectations and inaccessible information. I trust that you recognise these challenges. My view, for what it's worth, is that tackling these barriers needs three things. One, a renewed focus on skills development. Two, to connect with blind and partially sighted mentors and role models. And three, to encourage calculated risk taking. I'm hoping that some of this stuff complements your new VI curriculum framework. Please note that any views expressed here are mine, and they're not necessarily the views of my employer or any other organisation. So hopefully that means that the folks in the press office and the lawyers can all relax. So about me. I'm Dave Williams, RNIB Customer Experience Manager. I train organisations in developing an inclusive culture to maximise the potential of blind and partially sighted customers and colleagues. By becoming more inclusive, organisations can grow their customer retention and brand loyalty. Beyond RNIB, I chair the Braillist Foundation, an organisation I helped found and run. We are committed to spreading Braille literacy, especially amongst adults denied Braille education elsewhere. More about Braille in a bit. I was born with a rare genetic eye condition, Leber's congenital amaurosis, LCA. But you can relax. I'm not going to ask you to spell LCA. It means that I have no central vision, only light perception out of the corners of my eyes. My favourite questions I get about being blind are, in third place, do you see when you dream? Well, yes, a bit, but being sighted is not my dream. I'd rather win the Euro Millions. And while blindness can be deeply frustrating and some people will feel broken, honestly, I don't. In second place, do you want to know what I look like? Well, sometimes you can be assured that I have absolutely no interest in feeling anybody's face. If I need to know what somebody looks like, I'll ask a trusted friend. But thanks, Hollywood. And my number one favourite question I get asked about being blind is your son sighted? Well, yes, he is, but that's not why we had him, and I certainly don't hold it against him. It's not his fault. So let's talk about my education. I started at Derby School in Preston, Lancashire, a specialist school for partially sighted, not blind children. When I was in what we now call reception, they insisted that I write with massive, like felt tip pens. My nose was practically touching the paper, and even with the thickest of thick NHS glasses, I couldn't make out the blackboard or anything else that was going on. I knew my shapes, but that was mostly from sweets and coins and Lego. But I could only see them if they were properly coloured in a high contrast. And eventually, the penny dropped somewhere that really my eyesight wasn't up to much, and I'd be better learning some tactile skills. Braille. I was sent to St Vincent's School for blind and partially sighted children, Vinnie's in Liverpool, where I would be a boarder during the week and taxied home at the weekends when the taxi remembered to turn up. I once hid in the boot of a social worker's car, but that's another story. It was the early 80s, and I'm glad to report that the small number of children that still attend specialist schools now have access to smartphones, home weekends, visits from parents, social media, and hopefully they feel a little bit less isolated than I did. Truthfully, I was a bit of a bugger at school. When I wasn't in detention or given lines or even suspended for my many misdemeanours, and there were many midnight feasts and drinking and smoking, and anyway, moving swiftly on, you name it, I did it. I learnt to touch type. And I also learned to read and write using Braille. I could make a graph using pins and elastic bands. And I was told that I was the first Braille student at my school to get an A in GCSE maths. It must have been the first year that GCSEs were invented or something. As a teenager, I learnt to hate PE, swimming, French, and I even disliked learning Braille. I would occasionally lock myself in the boys' toilets to avoid lessons. Anyway, somehow I got 9 GCSEs, but more surprisingly was eventually made head boy. Someone somewhere believed in me, even if I didn't believe in myself. Amidst being in a short lived rock band, attempting to drink the student bar dry, and various girlfriends, I took my A levels in computing, maths, and psychology at the Royal National College for the Blind in Hereford. When I got to university, I completely lacked the self advocacy. When I got to university, I completely lacked the self advocacy skills that I needed to make my undergraduate maths learning resources accessible. I had naively believed that the uni would automatically take care of my access needs as a matter of course. If I was slipping before, I was now well on my way to sliding into a bit of a pit of anxiety and navel gazing and depression and general self loathing that would last for most of my 20s. On the one hand, my ego had been inflated by people telling me, you're bright and you're going to earn a fortune. And on the other hand, I was sitting in lectures listening to somebody squeaking on a whiteboard with a marker, clutching a print handout, neither of which I could see. I really didn't have a clue what was going on. So I moved to another university that seemed to have a much more evolved sense of what constitutes accessible learning resources. For a while there, I read education studies, politics, and philosophy. I think, therefore, I don't actually want to be here. By then, I'd really stopped caring. And so it was, on to the University of Life. Despite my disruptive behaviour and months wasted in bed, I honestly believe that I was lucky to benefit from a good education. As you will hear, Braille literacy, mobility, and technology have served me extremely well into my adult life. So let's talk about Braille skills. My younger self would have been amazed to hear that in the August of 2019, I dragged my family to the small town near Paris to visit Louis Braille's house. It helps that the museum is close to Disneyland. And somehow I even remembered some of my schoolboy French. Braille provides blind and partially sighted people with an independent opportunity to read and write by touch, freeing our ears to access the people and environment around us. Audiobooks, much like this presentation, will keep playing whether anyone is listening or not. Braille requires the reader to actively decode symbols into meaningful language, much like print for sighted students. When as a boy I was confronted with bulky beige books, I had absolutely no idea how Braille's invention was initially met with stiff opposition from sighted authorities. We're told that books were burned and tools were locked away. But Braille is closely linked with the emancipation of blind people. The genius of the Braille code is that each letter, number, and punctuation symbol made from a combination of 6 little dots fits neatly under a human fingertip and can be used to read and write any subject in any language. Identifying tactile print letters is painfully slow. Braille removes that barrier. And what about text-to-speech software? Doesn't that now replace Braille for most tasks? Have you tried listening to a screen reader speak a recipe, poetry, music notation, quadratic equation, or even the periodic table? Who wants to have greetings cards? Imagine that, your birthday card. Who wants to have that read to them? Or even a menu in a restaurant? We need to mix our own preferred combination of Braille speech and large print. Gary O'Donoghue is a successful blind journalist currently working for BBC News in Washington, D.C. as their chief North American political correspondent. Gary is adamant that he could not do his job, often reading pieces to camera, without Braille. Blindness organisations around the world report an anecdotal link between Braille literacy and the employability of blind people. When I became a dad, I couldn't find any better way of independently reading the bedtime story with my baby son. He's 13 now, and the other day he informed me after a long train journey that, you know what, Dad, the great thing about books is that the batteries never run out. Yeah, no kidding. And given that he spends many a waking hour on the Xbox or Instagram, this was music to my ears. Your blind students one day may need to read their own kids the bedtime story, or even deliver a eulogy for a lost loved one, or perhaps a best man speech. I couldn't have done any of those things without Braille. And thanks to tactile skills, as a family, we learn a lot about each other playing board games. Monopoly, for example, is very popular choice in this house. My music teacher taught me to play chess, a game that I still enjoy losing. I keep a tactile chess set safely stowed away in the corner of my favourite local pub, where I sometimes try to beat the regulars. And it is true that I proposed to my wife by popping the question on a Braille Scrabble board. I waited a very long time while she rummaged around in the Scrabble bag to find the answers, to find the letters for the answer. When I was a kid, I believed that Braille segregated me from sighted people. I have learned that it means that I can do many of the same things as sighted people. During the first COVID-19 lockdown, when blind and partially sighted people couldn't get supermarket deliveries, I took my hard copy Braille shopping list with me to Aldi. I needed my ears to help with social distancing. We can be optimistic about Braille's future. In the last decade, the software to produce electronic Braille has appeared in almost every modern smartphone, tablet, and laptop, meaning that we've never had so much potential access to content in Braille. The Unified English Braille Code that has been adopted in the UK and around the world is more robust for accurately translating between Braille and print. And devices like Orbit Reader are helping to reduce the cost of refreshable Braille hardware. The Braillist Foundation has demonstrated over the last 2 years that conference platforms like Zoom can be used to teach Braille skills remotely when face-to-face options are not available. Braille is an indispensable tool, yet Braille is so often poorly understood and denied to blind people who need it most to find our own voices. And for those kids who are lucky enough to learn Braille, often they have restricted access to Braille reading and writing equipment. Consider the number of opportunities that sighted children must have to be exposed to the written word throughout the course of a typical day. Restricting the opportunities to read stifles our growth. We should continue to invest in Braille for as long as we invest in print. Let's turn to mobility. At school, I was taught how to safely cross roads and how to negotiate staircases using a long white cane. And while I was far too self-conscious to use my cane for most of my teens, I would rely on it later when finding the pub or travelling by train to football matches. As well as signalling to others that I can't see, feeling the ground 2 strides ahead of my feet enables me to find trip hazards and other obstacles, especially in unfamiliar environments. At home, my foster mother, wait, didn't I mention that I was raised in care? Anyway, she encouraged me at the age of 12 to go on the bus by myself to visit my actual mother. And later, she let me fly to the Netherlands to visit a girl who I'd met on a school trip. I'm not quite sure how much the social services knew about that little adventure, but it did wonders for my self belief. I would need all my mobility skills, excuse me, to pursue my fascination with astronomy. I find the wonders of the universe really humbling. I've been lucky enough to not quite see two solar eclipses. First in 1999, when an uncle took me to a camping holiday in Helston in Cornwall. I hate tents. It was me who was bricking it as we clambered along the rocky outcrops of the Lizard Peninsula. My second eclipse was in 2017 when I maxed out the credit card to take my family on a Caribbean cruise. And as my wife couldn't take her guide dog, it really was my cane that found our way around those ports, beaches, and the Kennedy Space Center. I once found my way to the front of the queue at a book signing by Sir Patrick Moore of the Sky at Night fame, a long running TV programme on the BBC. And when I quipped to Sir Patrick that he probably didn't get many blind astronomy fans coming to his talk, he said that actually I'd be surprised. Always grounding to be reminded that I'm really no more special than anyone else. Turns out that Galileo, hundreds of years ago, continued to make important scientific discoveries after he lost his eyesight. Many of the 20 or so countries that I visited, I have done so alone, and I can trace my travel back to those early mobility lessons and my many mishaps, falling down concrete steps at university when I absolutely refused to use my cane because I hadn't accepted my blindness. We must be allowed to learn from our own mistakes, bounce off things, fall over and pick ourselves up and really learn to carry on. I wonder what James Holman, the 19th century blind explorer who is believed to be the first blind person to circumnavigate the globe, would make of our modern navigation tools available to blind people today. Accessible GPS apps like Good Maps Outdoors, combined with bone conduction headphones, are augmenting core mobility skills to provide extra information about points of interest in our environment, boosting confidence and supporting independent travel. The future promises more reliable and accurate coverage, smart canes, and autonomous vehicles. Speaking of technology, at Vinnie's in the early 1990s, we were told earnestly that Microsoft Windows and this new thing called the World Wide Web would probably never be accessible to blind people, but we'd probably have to learn a bit about them anyway. Thanks for that. Well, never say never. My school loaned me a Eureka A4, a portable personal computer with a Braille keyboard, voice output, built-in modem, a word processor, and other educational and personal organizer apps, as well as a sophisticated music composer. The large family of Eureka users included school children like me, but also professionals, as well as pensioners and many famous blind people, such as Stevie Wonder. I learnt a lot from that little machine, and it gave me a glimpse into the power of specialist technology to assist blind people to be productive and compete on a level playing field. Mr. Irvine and I started a school computer club where blind kids would divide our time between playing adventure games. I remember an audio version of Space Invaders, and we tried to code. Yeah, I was bad at that too. But blind people are successful programmers and do work in the field. I know one blind guy who works for a supplier to the MOD, developing software control systems for tanks. While I didn't really want to work in the VI sector, I was persuaded to volunteer for my local blindness charity in Preston, teaching older people to shop online. Volunteering to beta test screen reading software would eventually lead me to working at Dolphin Computer Access for most of my 30s, starting in customer support and then product management, testing, design, and marketing. We worked with Nuance Communications and Microsoft, who were some of the first people in the world to make smartphone technology accessible to blind people years before Apple and Android. While it is moving to hear Tim Berners-Lee, the father of the web, declare that the web is for everyone, as important for blind people was the work by people like Ted Henter and David Kostashian and Torsten Brandt, giants of accessible technology who did the work on the ground, designing and developing screen reading solutions that would inspire the accessibility software that we now find on every smartphone, tablet, and laptop. Screen reader access to Windows, the web, smartphones, and even touchscreens all became a reality because pioneering blind people decided that it would. We now need innovators to believe that artificial intelligence, augmented reality, and autonomous vehicles can also include everyone. Maybe some of your students will take up these challenges. We also need to find ways of advocating for existing solutions to be fully accepted in the workplace. Your blind students will need to articulate to potential employers how we can get the job done. I have been turned down for jobs. I've been turned down for numerous jobs due to outdated attitudes to assisted technology and inaccessible systems, including one selling greetings cards, essentially because the company didn't want my screen reader software on their system. That stuff still happens. And if we are to improve those unemployment statistics, all of us must do a better job of communicating the benefits for employers of employing blind people, such as our loyalty, creativity, ability to problem solve, being detail oriented, and so on. Like lots of blind kids, I used to listen to the radio long into the night. I desperately ached to learn the skills needed to get on air. I recorded myself speaking for hours. It was my history teacher who one day asked if I would like to deliver a reading at Liverpool's Catholic Cathedral. Learning about when to breathe, timing, pacing, where to pause, and where to place the emphasis, I was hooked. I volunteered as the school's returning officer at our mock elections just so that I could deliver the results and practice my public speaking skills. At the Royal National College in Hereford, I got to try my hand at acting in front of a live audience with the performing arts students. In a production of Dennis Potter's Blue Remembered Hills, I played a pyromaniac who struck live matches in front of an actual bale of hay. Yes, there was a risk assessment and a fire extinguisher at the ready, but how many drama teachers these days would honestly cast a blind kid in such a role? Perhaps the safety aspects of lighting Bunsen burners in the science labs at Vinnie's had been useful after all. Radio is a well trodden career path for blind people. One of my fellow blind actors in that production, Ryan Kelly, he went on to become a regular on The Archers, the world's longest running radio drama. Another blind classmate, Chris McCausland, after 15 years of knocking on the door, somebody let him in, and he's now a successful comedian, appearing on shows like Have I Got News for You, QI, and last year he even performed at the Royal Variety Performance. And Chris will soon be hosting You Heard It Here First, a Radio 4 panel show. And who isn't impressed by Lucy Edwards, who was the first blind DJ on Radio 1 and is now featuring in TV adverts for shampoo? Unfortunately for listeners, I've managed to talk my way into several radio stations. Some even let me behind the microphone. I taught myself how to edit audio, first on tapes and later using a computer. I remember hearing a public telephone service that was badly in need of a fresh voiceover. So I sent in a cheeky letter with a speculative recording to the company, and lo and behold, much to my surprise, I got the gig. After uni, I became embroiled with the American Council of the Blind, volunteering, presenting shows, and coordinating their internet radio service. Volunteering is a massively underrated opportunity. It gives us a chance to meet mentors, practice skills, and to demonstrate our worth as blind people. Eventually, I secured a 3-year contract with the American Council of the Blind to lead ACB Radio, where I would develop live coverage of several conferences on blindness, both in the US and in South Africa. And at one of those conferences, I was lucky enough to meet Michael Hingson, whose blindness skills meant he survived the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. At ACB Radio, we also broadcast interviews with people like Eric Wagemeyer, who was the first blind adventurer to summit Mount Everest. I was beginning to realize that blind people did not have to just accept whatever hand life had dealt us. We have a say in our own destiny. I have also been an occasional reporter for BBC Radio 4 on their In Touch programme and been lucky enough to work with Peter White, covering access to voting, parenting, travel, participation in sport, and how blind veterans remembered at the cenotaph on the centenary of the armistice. My next radio adventure is just around the corner, and I've been asked to help present RNIB's Tech Talk, a technology program on RNIB Connect Radio. So if you've got an accessible technology story to share, I'd really love to hear from you. My domestic skills have really never been my strong suit. Cremating endless batches of rock buns and fairy cakes. Don't we call them cupcakes now? I think I missed that meeting. In domestic science classes, well, it didn't really fully prepare me for the bread making frenzy of that first COVID-19 lockdown. And while I can now just about master a £1 loaf, mostly thanks to Mary Berry, I'm generally rubbish in the kitchen. But that really has much more to do with my own incompetence rather than my blindness. I order a mean Indian takeaway on Just Eat or Deliveroo, and I know my way round the Tesco app. We subscribe to Gusto, one of those food box subscription services. We use VoiceOver to access the recipes, and apps like Seeing AI and Be My Eyes can help with identifying ingredients. My wife taught me that you can still read Braille from a Braille display through a plastic sandwich bag, handy in the kitchen with all that bread flour flying around. At school, I also learnt to make a bed, change a plug, fold a sheet or in a shirt, skills that all parents struggle to pass on to our teenagers. My son probably won't need to change a plug. We don't need to do that so much anymore. But he may need to change a tyre. He's a keen cyclist. I do take some pride in teaching him to ride a bike. I taught him to ride using the time-honoured tradition of following along behind and letting go of the seat when I thought that he wouldn't notice, and then apologising when he fell off. Teaching him how to sort his clothes and to use a washing machine, well, those things are a work in progress. When it came to sports, well, I really had more enthusiasm as a spectator rather than an active participant. Some of you may have met the late Frank McFarlane, who was a tutor on the Birmingham QTVI course. Mr. Mac, as we called him, as well as being my English teacher, he was also a keen sportsman and taught many of his students to play blind cricket. I remember his tactile diagram depicting the layout of a cricket field with all the positions labelled in Braille. Perhaps then it wasn't so much of a coincidence that years later, a blind cricket team I'd been involved in helping establish here in Worcestershire, we won our regional blind cricket development league. I took up tandem cycling in my late 30s, and with a team from Dolphin, where I worked at the time, we completed Ride London, a 100-mile sportive on closed roads around the capital, and raising thousands of pounds for Blind Veterans UK. My cycling eventually became running, and a year after completing Couch to 5K, I lined up with 53,000 runners on the start line of the New York City Marathon. I somehow managed to finish in front of about 30,000 of them. Running, of course, has changed my life beyond all recognition, but obviously the health benefits, losing weight, etc. But also the social benefits, feeling part of the community, meeting new people, increasing my own visibility and travelling to races, etc. If you've never been to a park run, and one blind lady I know has done over 300, they are a very welcoming environment for blind and partially sighted people of all ages and abilities. So I'd highly recommend it. An accessible fitness technology, particularly Apple Watch, has been tremendously valuable for me to keep motivated and able to track my progress. So, some final thoughts. If I've learned anything in my 45 years and 5 months as living as a blind person, it is that some lessons can only be learned by connecting with other blind people who have been there and done it. Forums such as VI Talk and the RNIB network of regional Facebook groups are where we as blind people share information about health and well-being, lifestyle, leisure, welfare, money, technology, work and learning. If you want to know how blind people do stuff, connecting with these communities could be a good place to start. It was my Uncle Ian who bought my first shaver, and I kept it in a drawer for months because I was too scared to use it until somebody showed me how. My uncle was one of those people who recognised that were I ever to succeed, I must be allowed and actually positively encouraged to take risks. He found me work experience and he encouraged me to travel. The National Federation of the Blind in the United States, well, they famously have blind people teaching each other how to use chainsaws. The point is that blind and partially sighted people are going to take risks. And as a community, we can learn from each other about the art of mitigation and how to make those risks safe, but not too safe. Mobility and exploration skills are vital for enabling independent travel. Reading for yourself is a joy to behold and not a chore to be endured. As blind people, we must learn that to be self-advocating for the support that we need to learn from failure and to develop confident living skills and earn the respect of our sighted peers are absolutely necessary if we want to be accepted as full and active contributors in our communities. Thank you.